Hi everyone, I'll make this relatively short. Today I'm doing a reaction to a 10-minute fragment of From Lenin to Zizek, The Disgraceful End of Western Marxism, featuring Gabriel Rockhill. I'm not a great fan of these kinds of discussions, but at least I came in with some certainty that I get what I had come for. Indeed, this happened to be the case. The aforementioned excerpt shall be appended to the end of my rant. There are two persons in the video making the points I'm addressing, Carlo and Gabriel, and as they are pretty much complementary and I do not particularly care to differentiate between them for the purpose of this video, I shall refer to them as the speaker. So without further ado, the speaker has regurgitated the already pretty worn-out claim that the precondition, stimulus, cause of Russia's invasion into my country was the threat of NATO expansion. Firstly, before Russia's infringement on our territorial integrity, our nascent desire to join NATO was seen as a joke. Nobody was considering it seriously. Secondly, one need not be a genius to see Russia's open admission of wanting to lay claim to whatever used to be part of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Moreover, to assimilate the populace thereof into a bleak mass of its own rabble of populists. The Western Marxists and socialists who support our right to defend ourselves are treated by Gabriel as short-sighted, naive puppets of Western imperialism who do not see the grand geopolitical picture and thus cannot do the callous calculation of what is needed to tactically, not strategically, as the speaker stresses, get closer to the goal of a socialist renaissance. Guess what? Support the bulwarks against global imperialism, Russia, China, Iran. Somehow, supporting the two imperialist powers, one waging a crippling war in the name of revisionist and revanchist imperialism, the other on the quest to colonize the world through economic integration, is the way to a desired multipolar world, which can become a cradle of socialism and a grave of capitalism. I suppose going back to the century of Marx is the goal. The more empires, the more poles there are. Hence, socialism shall dawn upon the wretched world. Well, if you only know a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail, doesn't it? Last but not least, if we look at this common thread, which is, I must confess, an inspiration for this video, we can find some other idiosyncrasies. Firstly, Finland's tradition of neutrality, the one forced upon it by a self-styled socialist state, perchance? Secondly, the great distinction drawn between the Baltic states' relationship to Russia and that of Ukraine. What's being hinted is that Ukrainians are somehow culturally much closer to Russians. A pretty interesting point, taking into consideration the three of us, Poles and Lithuanians, had a common polity for way longer than any of us had the misfortune of being part of Russia. In addition, our past cultural and political autonomy was forcefully disestablished by Catherine, not particularly great, in the second half of the 18th century. The history of this region is slightly more nuanced than what the speaker offered us in his comment. Also, sadly, unbeknownst to him, it appears Latvia and Estonia, Baltic states, are in far greater danger of being claimed as part of one of your favorite bulwarks against imperialism. Somehow, if you get freed from the global imperialism, your local friendly imperialism just slaughters or assimilates you, which is but a small price for the end goal of future world communism. Well, what can I say? That was a nice piece of Soviet nostalgia and tunnel vision. Now, have a nice day, and enjoy the excerpt, if you will.
By Israel on Iran or the military conflict in Ukraine. So it's not rare to see leading figures of Western Marxism, such as Zizek, for example, endorse Ukraine using pretty much idealistic and liberal arguments such as the defense of democracy and self-determination, completely ignoring the material circumstances that led to the conflict, which I think we should understand as rooted in the NATO expansion. Equally, the Western Marxist left has engaged for years in endorsing struggles in favor of civil rights in Iran, which, if in themselves are understandable and correct, are nevertheless directed against a tenet of the resistance against imperialists and not against other states, whose breach of human rights is even more blatant. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, how do you diagnose these, let's say, idealistic framing that some Western Marxists adopt to either go for there's a multiplicity of imperialism, or even argue that there's some imperialism that are worse than the others because they're also non-democratic. And so that's the first question. And the other one is, how should a genuine left engage with polities, such as, for example, Iran, that clearly cannot be taken as an example of a polity that we should aim for, but that in this context could maybe seen as tactical allies, at least?
That's a great question. I'm glad you raised it, because it is true that when you look at the Western Marxists today, the ones who are living, there are a few exceptions, but for the most part, they have contributed to a kind of moral and political condemnation of particular states without any geostrategic analysis whatsoever. And so the basic idea is that, each state is condemned because it is, usually Zizek will use terms like fascist. That's how he condemns China, for instance. I know you weren't referring to China, but or Russia as authoritarian, Putinist, etc. And the condemnation, similar moral and political condemnations of Iran. And what, of course, one should notice is that these political and moral condemnations, without a broader geostrategic analysis, segue perfectly with the U.S. State Department logic of democracy promotion. Right? So these intellectuals are doing the bidding, willingly or not, of the interests of imperialism. Etienne Balibar is another person that we should reference in this regard, a famous student of Louis Althusser, who also said that pacifism is not an option in the Ukraine and has argued for arming the so-called Ukrainian resistance, and so takes a position very, very similar to Zizek, so you see the kind of continuities. What this approach lacks is a dialectical assessment of geopolitics today, and there's a kind of collapse in which one thinks, well, each state should just be analyzed in terms of particular moral categories. Do they line up on our Western understanding of democracy or of human rights or things like this? And if there's a correlation between the two, which there generally is not, then we would support them, and if not, then they're to be condemned. With little or no analysis of the very logics of human rights discourse, which has been one of the main ways that anti-communist destabilization campaigns have been run for decades, or an analysis of bourgeois democracy, which is, of course, the best democracy that the capitalist ruling class could buy. So why is it that we want to wish that on peoples around the world? Getting, though, to the most important part of your question, which is the second part, I think that from a dialectical and materialist vantage point, one has to distinguish between tactical alliances and a strategic orientation. So it's not just that you look at a state and judge it once and for all from the kind of moral guidelines and say, well, everything they're doing is to be condemned. States don't exist on their own. States exist, all of them, in relation to the global social totality. There's not Iran on its own or Russia on its own. Like, these are complete myths. So how is Russia, how is Iran situated within the overall global dynamic? And most importantly, the struggle against imperialism and the struggle for a multipolar world as a stepping stone towards the spread of socialism in at least an ideal setting. In this regard, it's very, very clear that the US imperial agenda is to destroy the integration of the Eastern world. With the rise of China as the leading self-declared socialist state in the world, China has been integrating itself economically, infrastructurally with projects of national development that are not Marxist, that are not socialist. Its reasons for doing that, I think, are very astute, and we could go on quite at length about that. But it's a project for internationally developing the global South in order to stretch and eventually break the chains of imperialism. Some people might have criticisms of the way in which they're doing this, but they are focused on the socioeconomic base and on global development. And they're working then with non-socialist countries and even anti-socialist countries. But in doing that, I think the overall strategy is to stretch and eventually break the chains of imperialism. And that's what's going on. Like, the reason that the US is freaking out is because this project is successful. And the three principal reference points within Asia for that, of course, are Russia and Iran. If you look at US geostrategy over the last decade or so, it has been recognized that the war against China, I mean, all these wars are constant, but a hotter war against China, it's pretty clear. Atilio Boron, one of the greatest analysts of geopolitics from Latin America, has claimed that all of the war games that the Pentagon has run demonstrate that the war against China is unwinnable. So the Democrats were in office and they decided, well, let's try to kick out Russia and run a NATO-backed war against Russia by using Ukraine as a proxy. That didn't work out so well because that failed. Trump comes into office and is a supporter of the Greater Israel Project. And one of the projects clearly was, well, let's use another proxy, Israel, in order to wage a war against what's perceived as the weakest leg of this kind of three-legged table in the East, and that is Iran. In 12 days, they failed. They're going to continue to try in various ways, but what we have to see is that in the current geostrategic setting, the idea that you would support like human rights or the liberation of women or all of these other things that they trump up, that they did in Libya, that they've done in Afghanistan, that they used in Iraq, all of this is just a thin liberal cover for an imperialist project of destroying the integration of the East. So we see that Iran and Russia, tactically, not strategically, but tactically, as a bulwark against global imperialism. So we have to be able to do something that's actually very simple, but it's almost never done on the Western left, unfortunately, and that is think two things at once. Recognize that these are tactical allies in a struggle to build a multipolar world, but we don't have to strategically say then, oh, I support Putin and everything that he represents in Russia, or I support everything that's represented in Iran. You could say the same thing for Hamas. And so in that regard, we need a kind of dialectical materialist analysis of the global struggle against imperialism and a distinction between kind of tactical allies and the strategic horizon.